Apple's AirPods Pro site is an excellent example of using the scroll position in the browser to control a 3D render. And this uses an image sequence. If you look at how the page is built, you can see that each frame of the rendered video has its own JPEG. Each frame is an image. In other words, as you scroll, the animation, the video advances. Now, what we'll do in this video is kind of the same concept, an image sequence based on our scroll position. And because AirPods take much longer to model correctly, we'll do a really simple version of this using a phone. We'll make this in Cinema 4D. And we'll place that phone inside a grid-based layout. At the end, it'll respond to our scroll position and rotate as we move down the page. We're going to build this from scratch, from the very beginning. We'll build it in Cinema 4D, we'll render it in After Effects, we'll export it as a Lottie animation using a plugin called BodyMovin.
BodyMovin, the plugin. The plugin, BodyMovin.
It's an extension.
It still ends in the same thing.
Extension ends with an N, BodyMovin ends with a G.
No.
Yes.
BodyMovin.
BodyMovin.
No G, BodyMovin.
Extension.
We'll drop that into Webflow, and we'll make the animation respond on scroll. First part, Cinema 4D. This is not Cinema 4D. It's After Effects, which we can verify by going to After Effects, About After Effects, and taking a look at the title card where it says Adobe After Effects. But for now, we can close out of this window and instead go to File, New, and in After Effects, many people don't notice this, but we have an option to create a Maxon Cinema 4D file right here from the File, New menu. Let's click that, and we're prompted to save a file, a Cinema 4D file. So let's do that right here. We'll call it Phone Rotate. And when we do that, Cinema 4D loads right up. And once it's loaded, we can see the basic interface for Cinema 4D. Now, you'll notice, depending on your exact view, that Cinema 4D will darken the viewport here. In the middle, the parts that aren't darkened, this is what will show up once we render in After Effects later on. The first thing we're going to do before we build our phone is set some of our settings, our render settings. And we can do that right up here by pressing Edit Render Settings. And let's change our size. Let's make this 1000 pixels wide. And we'll do a height. This is going to be a simple rotation. Let's do a height of maybe 250 pixels. We can always make changes to this at a later time. That's pretty good. We'll keep the frame rate and everything else the same right there. Okay, let's resize our viewport so we can more accurately work with that object we're making. And speaking of which, this is the time in which we're going to build a phone. Let's create a new primitive here. We're going to add a cube object by pressing right here. We can also press and hold to take a look at some of the other objects in Cinema 4D, but for now, we'll do a cube. And that's it. This is going to be the basic structure of our phone. And instead of making it perfectly dimensionally accurate, we're just going to eyeball what a phone would look like, on account of this being an entirely fictional phone. So we're just grabbing the edges here and resizing, again, eyeballing it. And there are a number of ways in Cinema 4D to rotate around an object, to rotate throughout the viewport. And we're just going to grab up here this rotation button, press and drag, and that'll let us see different aspects of it. We can also use the number 3 on the keyboard. So just press and hold the number 3, and then you can click and drag anywhere in the viewport. That also lets us rotate. So you might see us switch between different ways of doing that. Okay, let's rotate to the side. This is going to be advertised as the world's thinnest smartphone, so let's make it even thinner. That looks pretty comically thin. And what we can do is turn on Fillet. And when we do that, it rounds everything. And we can use zoom right here to zoom in and get a little closer so we can see what's going on the edges. That looks pretty good as is. And another quicker way to zoom, where 3, if we press 3 and click and drag to rotate, we can use the same thing with 2 to zoom. You can just click and drag anywhere in the viewport to zoom. And this is the basic structure of our phone. We're going to add a few more items to this. So instead of creating a new cube from scratch, let's just copy and paste, pressing Command-C, Command-V, or Control-C, Control-V on Windows. And we have another cube. We can't see it because it's taking up the same space, but if we move it this way, we can see that there's another cube in that space. Let's move it here to create volume buttons. Let's make it a lot thinner this way, a lot thinner this way. So it's almost a pill shape right now. And let's go in so we can get a little bit closer to this so we can size everything appropriately. Let's change our Y size, our height, to maybe 1.75 centimeters. Again, we're just eyeballing this to create volume buttons. So let's do the same thing, Command-C, Command-V to duplicate that. Now we have 2 volume buttons, and we can select both of them at once, holding down Shift and clicking the second one. We can zoom out, and we can position these volume buttons maybe a little bit farther over here. And maybe decrease that height to 1.5 5. And zoom in right here. Submerge them a little bit more in the overall phone shape. Let's zoom out. That looks pretty good. Maybe they can be a little more defined, just moving them out. And whereas holding down 3 and clicking and dragging rotates, 2 is zoom, 1 lets us move throughout the viewport. So these are essentially mapping. These are keyboard shortcuts that map for move. It's the same thing as using move up here, zoom up here, and rotate up here. We're using the same thing with keyboard shortcuts. So you'll see us demonstrate that throughout this video, some other videos that include work inside Cinema 4D. Zoom out. Take a look at the phone overall, maybe a little bit of a movement right here. The volume buttons might be a little large. We could decrease the size, the X size of this to maybe 10 and move them a little bit closer together. We can always change this later, but that looks pretty good for now. And this is about the shot we want. And let's create a camera. And anything that's in a camera, whatever we create in this camera is what's going to serve as the basis for what we export, what ends up on the actual web page. So with this camera, we just created it. If we move around the viewport, we can actually take a look at the camera we just created. But in order to see what the camera sees, we're going to press this target icon right here. That's going to move us. That's going to move our field of view into what the camera sees. And now we're looking at what the camera sees. A few changes right here. Let's decrease this. Let's remove that rotation. Let's move this towards the center, just changing our X value. This is the position to 0. So now we're looking at the phone. Now, if we zoom in or rotate or make any changes while the camera element is selected, that could affect the camera's position. So instead, we can move out and take a look at what the camera's looking at. We can move the camera closer, farther away. We can also do multiple views, but for now, this might be pretty close to what we're looking for. That's looking good. We can also affect zoom on the camera, just affecting the focal length of what the camera sees here. That looks pretty great. Let's render this frame. So we'll press render view, and that gives us an idea of what this looks like if it's rendered. This is what it would look like on the web page if we rendered everything right now. There's no animation, there's no texturing. So let's take care of both of those right now. First thing, these 2 cubes right here, we can name them. We can say volume 1. We can call this one volume 2. We can call this phone body. And we can take volume 1 and volume 2 and drag those to be children objects of phone body. When we do that, now when we move the phone body, if we rotate the phone body, the volume buttons move with the phone. Let's Command Z or Control Z to undo right now, and let's start animating. So just like After Effects, Cinema 4D works based on keyframes. When you animate in Cinema 4D, you can use keyframes. So that's exactly what we'll do. We're at 0 frames right here. We want to add a keyframe. The phone body is selected, and we want its initial position to be over here. Let's rotate to a wider top view of the phone, and let's grab that keyframe. Let's create a keyframe. And now if we drag our playhead position and we go to the end, we can create another keyframe. Maybe look a little bit at the bottom of the phone like this, and create a second keyframe. If we rotate, we can see the animation works exactly as we'd expect. We can also take the camera and affect its rotation. Maybe we want it to point down to 6.5 degrees or so. Maybe 6 is a nice compromise. That looks really solid. Let's texture this. So to create a texture, we're going to create new material, and we'll drag this material right on top of the phone body. That means it'll affect the phone body itself, and since there's not a texture on the volume buttons, it'll also affect the texture of the volume buttons. And we can make changes at any time, so let's select both these volume buttons and maybe submerge them a little bit more, because it might look a little weird with 2 pronounced protuberances on the side of the phone like this. Let's submerge them a little bit more. That looks pretty good. So, texturing. We've applied the texture. Let's double click that material to edit. And let's change the color to black. Let's do that here. And we'll play with reflectance. And there are a few options with specularity we can adjust here. So specularity, if the width is increased, generally that means things are going to look more matte. So if we drag, it looks like a almost plastic type of phone. But if we decrease that width, it gets more of a shine, like a polished metal or glass look. So we're going to decrease that width a lot. And we're going to increase the strength of that specularity. If we up that specular strength, we get a nice piercing reflection on the side. And we can come back to specularity, but for now, let's close out the material editor and add some lights. So we'll create one light, and if we render right now with this light placed right here, this is what it looks like. nothing. And to see why this is, let's click out of our camera view real quick, and we can look at this from the side. When we render, we can't see anything because the light is currently inside the phone, the fake phone we created. And we can use the shortcut Command-R or Control-R on PC to quickly see the rendered view. There's absolutely nothing to show on the screen. So if we just adjust the position of this light and then go back to that camera, we can see there is now something. It's reflecting on the side. So if we render now, we can make out the corner, the edge of the phone. Let's do that. Let's create a few lights. Copying and pasting, moving lights over here so we can see the volume buttons. Let's move this one back a little bit. Let's copy and paste again, or let's just paste again and move another light, perhaps back and to the left. If we render now, we're starting to get a little bit of an idea of the shape of this phone. And we can do another light, or at any time we can just press this light button to add another light. Let's put that up here, maybe move it back a little bit so we see a little bit of an edge. Let's render that. And raise it up a little bit and move it back. It might be helpful to zoom out and go out of the camera view for this, so we can really have control over the positioning of the light. Back in the camera, can't really see it. So let's zoom out again. Sometimes it can help to have multiple views here. So let's go to Panel, Arrangement, and let's do 2 views stacked. So we're keeping this view, and then we can change the second one. Currently this is a top view. We can change this view to an actual camera perspective. And to do that, we can go to Cameras and Perspective. To make sure we're seeing what the camera sees, let's make sure our target is selected. So now we're seeing what the camera sees. By default, it's showing a wireframe. We can just go to Display and choose one of our shading options. That looks pretty good. So now, with our top view up here, we can move around and adjust the position of this light. And we can click and drag to see how it looks as the phone rotates. That light might be a little intense. We can drop its intensity. So we can still see the shine on the phone, but it's not as piercing. So that looks okay. Zoom out a little bit more because our light is quite far up. And let's copy and paste to create yet another one. We'll move it over to the side. We'll move it back a little bit, maybe up a little more. And if we click into our second view and hit render, again, that other light might be too intense. Let's make sure it's selected, decrease that intensity a little bit. And we might even want to go into our material and widen that specularity a little bit. So this is if it's very wide, this is a little less wide, maybe 20%. And then decrease that specular strength, maybe to 175. That looks pretty good. Let's render, and that looks solid. Now, one more note about lights. It might not be immediately obvious how thin the phone is if, when rotating, we can't see the edges. Get an idea based on that specular highlight on that lighting itself that it's a pretty thin phone, but it might help to have some type of definition on this right side. So let's create another light, and we can move it over here and pull back a little bit. There we go, just so we can see that edge. Maybe lower it a little bit, pull it back, so we can see that edge. Let's drop the Y value to -20 or so. That's looking pretty good, maybe even 25. Nope, back to 20. Render. Now we're making out that edge a little bit. There's another way to do this, and that's we can grab the material itself and make the entire phone, instead of black, we can make it a very dark gray. So there's a little more detail. That might not look as good. Let's try a much lower value, like 4. That might look a little better, but overall, we get the idea that the phone is a thin phone. We get the idea that it has boundaries. That specular highlighting is helping us a lot. We can even animate that new light we just created. If we click into our top view here, we can just click the H button to reset our viewport. And what we can do is zoom out a little bit. Let's grab that new light we just created, and let's add a keyframe. We know we want the light right around here to be positioned right there, but let's pull back and move the starting position of that light a little bit. Let's pull back here, maybe back there, add a keyframe, and now that light's going to move, and you're going to see the specularity, that edge, kind of roll off, especially right around frame 62. And it ends, that specular highlight ends all the way at 90, right there on the edge. Let's select our lower view and render there. That looks pretty solid. We could do this all day, but for now, let's save. We can just go to File, Save. Now, instead of rendering this in Cinema 4D, let's use After Effects to render it as a JPEG sequence, a sequence of images. And if you haven't done this part before, we'll cover the details, but it's a good time to note we have a free course on Webflow University that covers all the details about using After Effects, Lottie, Webflow, so check that out if you haven't already. So we've saved our project, let's switch over to After Effects. And instantly, that Cinema 4D file we created earlier, that's in our project. So from there, we can just click and drag to New Composition, let go, and instantly we can see that render, each frame is visible in the timeline below. Now, the view we're seeing here is a little bit different from what we'd expect. It's showing us a different render view from what we'd expect. So let's go into Renderer and change that to Standard Final. And that looks a lot more like we'd expect. We just rotate through and it looks really good. Now, that gray that we said earlier, it might be a little intense. We can switch back over to Cinema 4D. We can go back into that material and change that to a really dark gray, 1%. All we have to do is save, go to File, Save, switch back over to After Effects, and it's updated instantly. Let's scroll through, see how it looks. And it looks pretty consistent throughout the entire thing. So how do we export it as an image sequence? Well, we'll just go up to Composition, add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. And there are a few things we're looking for. First is that the type of output is JPEG. We want to make sure it's a JPEG sequence. And if you click in here, you'll see the only option is JPEG sequence. That's fine. And the output file, let's put that in the same folder we used before. In fact, we'll create a new folder inside that, inside our phone animation folder. We'll call it image sequence, and we'll hit save. When we're ready, let's hit the play button to start the queue. And generally, Media Encoder is going to render this pretty quickly. It's a pretty simple project. And while it's rendering, it's a good time to end it's done. And once we render an image sequence, let's get it set up to export with the Body Moving plugin. Back to After Effects, let's save what we have, File, Save, and we can call it Phone Rotate. So we save the After Effects project. Let's create a new project. And once we create a new composition, all we have to do is drag in that image sequence. So we have the image sequence. This is what we output from Adobe Media Encoder just moments ago. And we're going to select all of them. So Command A or Control A on PC to select each of these frames. And let's drag them right into After Effects, into our project. That worked perfectly. Let's drag those right into this gray area down below. And After Effects will magically prompt us to set this whole thing up. So it's a single composition we're creating from all these frames. We're going to use the dimensions from any one of them because they're all the same size. We're going to make sure the still duration, the duration of each still, is set to 1 frame. So all zeros with a 1 at the end. And we're going to sequence the layers without overlapping. When that's set up, let's hit OK, and a composition will automatically be created with each frame we created in Cinema 4D. Let's just drag through, and we can see that's our animation. A series of still JPEGs that makes up the whole animation. And all we have to do to export it with Body Moving is go to Window, Extensions, Body Moving. We'll select this one for export by clicking Selected, and let's go into the settings and a few things to work on in Assets. Let's click Assets, 2 things. Let's enable compression, and we'll include the JPEGs, the image sequence in the JSON. Now, depending on the complexity of each of your images and your image sequence, you might want to play with compression so that we get realistic file sizes on output. 80 should work for this. Let's hit Save, and we'll choose the destination folder and the file name. Let's call it Phone Rotate, because we've called everything else Phone Rotate. When we're ready, render. And what the Body Moving plugin will do is take each of those images and sequence them out into a JSON file. And that'll take a few more seconds. 3, 2, 1, render's finished. That's exporting it. Let's make our way into Webflow. Now, what we have here is a page we built from scratch using a grid layout. And our goal is to get the Lottie animation we just exported inside this particular div block. How do we do that? Let's go over to the Assets panel. And we'll click Assets, go to Upload, and we're just going to choose that JSON file we exported a moment ago. Hit Open. How do we get that JSON file in the div block? We can just click and drag, and we can place it right inside Hero Image block. And that's it. If we go to preview this page, the Lottie animation plays instantaneously. And if that's what we're looking for, if we're looking for an animation that plays immediately upon page load, that's fine. And if we do that again, it looks pretty good. But we want to take it a step further. And this leads us into the last part of the process, setting up the interaction. We'll go over to interactions, and we're going to add a trigger on the page. This is an event while the page is scrolling. We want to animate. So on scroll, we're going to select our action here. We're going to create a new animation. It's going to be a scroll animation, and we'll simply add a new one right here. Let's call it phone rotate on scroll. And all we need is 2 different actions. We need an action at 0%. Let's make sure nothing else is selected. Let's select our Lottie animation and set a point at 0% when we're at the top of the page. At 0%, we want our Lottie animation to be at 0% at the start of the animation. But at 100%, this was automatically created when we added our first one. At 100%, we want it to be at the end of our Lottie animation. Now, sometimes going to the end, it'll get interpreted as beyond the last frame. So play with that to make sure it looks right. 99% will work well for now. And when we go into preview mode this time, nothing happens until we scroll. Because when we scroll this time, the animation is mapped to our scroll position. And that's it. All of this we did in 6 steps.
5 steps.
All of this we did in 5 steps. We modeled in Cinema 4D, we rendered in After Effects, we exported a Lottie JSON file, we imported that into Webflow, and we configured the interaction to respond on scroll. And that's tying an image sequence or a video to animate as we scroll through a page.